Hello, Modern America students. Um, this is going to be a little mini lesson where we left off on the Cold War, and you can go back and review some of those notes that we talked about if you need to. We kind of left off as World War II had ended. The Russians or the Soviets were worried about our atomic bomb. We were worried now about communism spreading. We left off with Winston Churchill, who at the time was now the former prime minister of Great Britain, and he will become prime minister again. And so he comes to the United States, goes on the radio, gives a speech down in Fulton, Missouri at Westminster College, and he warns the United States that a great evil is sweeping over Europe. And he describes it as the Iron Curtain, that the Soviet Union is spreading their communist influence over Eastern Europe, and without any help, could also spread it over Western Europe. So that's where we're going to start off here. Let's see, here's where we left off. We listened to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Excuse me. So what was the Iron Curtain? A political, military, and ideological barrier created by the Soviet Union after World War II to seal off itself and its allies from open contact with the West. So basically, it's a metaphor for this imaginary line. Sometimes they did have fencing. Sometimes they had nothing at all. But it was this imaginary line between democracies in the West and communist countries in the East. So here's some old leftover barbed wire fencing. Sometimes this separated countries, sometimes nothing at all. Just maybe signs saying, hey, you're now entering Czechoslovakia. You're now entering Eastern Germany, things like that. Here's a political cartoon from the 1940s. And remember, this is history to us. We can learn from it. But when these political cartoons were in the newspapers and magazines, this was telling people what was going on at the moment back in the 1940s. So as you can see here, you have a wall and a sign pointing to Russia on the other side. Looks like the railroad tracks stop right here. No admittance by order Joe. Who's Joe? That's right, Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. Who's this guy trying to see underneath there? That's right, Winston Churchill, leader of Great Britain. And then you can see maybe some people are scared, they're running away. You've got maybe a spy or somebody trying to see through there with binoculars, but you can't really see unless you climb over the top. And who's guarding it? Looks like soldiers. Lots of industry going on back here. Airplanes flying. You got the Soviet flag, hammer and sickle. Looks like some crumbling buildings on the western side. And so this is what Churchill is warning about. And you can see some of these countries that are going to come under Soviet influence. You're going to have communists in countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. These are countries that the communists rise up and the Soviets support them and they take power. And so what the United States is going to be worried about is this spreading. The first two countries we're going to talk about that they're worried about it spreading to are Greece and Turkey. And so what can the United States do to stop that? How can they contain communism into just this small area? Another political cartoon. The Iron Curtain. You've got your hammer and sickle here again that tells you this is a Soviet barrier. So how did Americans view Joseph Stalin? Well, back during World War II, he was a good guy. All right, they called him Uncle Joe. He was that good guy from across the ocean over in Russia, the Soviet Union, helping the United States and Great Britain. But shortly after the war, he becomes a bad guy, an evil dictator. He's spreading this evil communist idea. And Americans knew appeasement would not work. You couldn't appease him. You give him a little bit, like they started giving Hitler at the beginning of World War II. And so the United States was going to focus on containment. and be a part of this Cold War. Another political cartoon, Stalin kind of sticking his flags into different areas. How far can he go? We'll watch this link at a later date. It doesn't really work on these videos. Here's another political cartoon. The bear oftentimes is a symbol for Russia, big brown bear or grizzly bear. But if you didn't know that, how could you tell that this represented the Soviet Union or Russia at the time? That's right. His necklace is a hammer and sickle. And you can see the USSR, they're trying to spread their grasp or spread their power across the world. And who's this guy down here that might be a little bit afraid? That's right. Looks like Uncle Sam, probably representing, or not probably, he does represent the United States of America. What happened to Germany after World War II? Well, they split up the western part into 4 sections that was going to be they're going to help the United States, Italy, or not Italy, the United States, France, and Great Britain are going to rebuild the western part. And then Russia or the Soviet Union is going to rebuild the eastern part. What's this little dot here? That is Berlin. And so you have West Berlin and East Berlin are going to be the capitals. Initially, the idea was these 2 areas would be pushed back together. But by 1949, that just wasn't going to happen. And you have 2 countries that are going to be created. And so Germany is divided from 1949 to 1989. And as you can see, one of the problems with Berlin, the capital of West Germany, is that West Berlin is completely surrounded by East Berlin. And that's going to pose some problems. East Berlin, of course, East Germany is going to be communist. The Truman Doctrine is Americans and Congress and the president are getting worried about the spread of communism. President Harry Truman passes the Truman Doctrine, and this states that the United States would provide assistance and support to all nations under the threat from authoritarian forces or communism. Well, when you talk support, it can be a couple different things, right? It can be military aid, where you're actually sending soldiers, or oftentimes it's going to be money. And so that's one of the first things that they do. The first 2 places we mentioned before that we're experiencing kind of some internal conflict, some fighting amongst their own people, were Greece and Turkey, where you had communists in Greece facing off against nationalists in Greece, and communists in Turkey facing off against nationalists in Turkey. And both faced the possibility that they could become communist. Truman and Congress gather up about $400 million. You can see the Detroit News here, the newspaper. Truman asks $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey. New York Times, Truman acts to save the nations from red rule, asks $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey. Congress fight likely, but approval seen. You know, even back then, they don't like giving out money. And so here's another political cartoon. Obviously, this is Joseph Stalin. Here's his pipe. You can tell it's a Soviet pipe. It's got the hammer and sickle on there. And what is being shoved in his pipe? The Truman Doctrine. Maybe you've heard the old saying, shove that in your pipe and smoke it. And that's what this political cartoon is showing. Like, hey, this is going to stop communism. The second, and it was successful. Greece and Turkey did not become communist. The next time we give out a little bit of money is 1948, and it's called the Marshall Plan. And this was an assistance program to help rebuild Western Europe. We did not want them to become communist. And so this money, about $12.5 billion, is provided to countries in Western Europe to help them rebuild so that the Soviet Union doesn't help them rebuild and become communist. And there was a lot of destruction, whether it was in cities or their infrastructure, roads. airports, hospitals, schools, farms. It all needed help rebuilding. And here you can see kind of bar graphs that show a representation of the amount of aid. Obviously, Great Britain got a bunch, France gets a bunch. The idea, or the man that put it together, former General George Marshall, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, he wanted to help those in Western Europe who were living without shelter, jobs, and food. He puts this plan together. Basically, it kind of goes back to what we learned during World War I. When Germany was devastated after World War I, you were able to have kind of radical fascist leaders rise to power. We don't want that happening again. And so they're helping rebuild these places. A political cartoon. Looks like a race here. Where are they racing to? Western Europe. We've got Dr. U.S. Congress. Looks like that is the money, the aid, the Marshall Plan is heading to Western Europe. But who are they racing? Communism. And who is communism bringing, or what is communism bringing? Chaos. And this came out of the Minneapolis Star newspaper back in 1947. Minneapolis Star would eventually turn into the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Another one, got the US dollar, and they've turned the dollar into a soldier. They're fighting communism. Our money is fighting communism. The Mediterranean Patrol. Remember, the Mediterranean is the giant sea that separates Europe from Africa. Another one, this is basketball. Political cartoon, the Marshall Plan heading for the basket. Who can't touch it? Joseph Stalin. And the third way that we are going to look to stop the spread of communism is the Berlin blockade, or I should say the Berlin airlift. But the Berlin blockade was what the Soviets and what Eastern German communists set up, where they want to take all of Berlin. They don't want Western Berlin to be free and still be the capital of West Germany. So they set up a blockade where they stop letting the railroads run shipments of coal and food and whatever else they need in there. They block the canals. And so there's no way for Western Germany to get supplies to West Berlin. And they think at some point, the East Germans do, that Berlin will surrender and become part of East Germany. How do you get them supplies? Well, the Allies, especially the United States, decide they are going to deliver supplies using airplanes. And so they start flying airplanes. About 200,000 total airplanes in 1 year are going to fly over West Berlin, and they are going to drop and deliver supplies. And so here you can see the supplies are being loaded up onto planes. They have parachutes attached to them that they can drop off and float down. In this political ad, or this ad, you've got milk, the new weapon of democracy. Once again, we'll see this link in a little bit. But here we have people watching the airplane flying over. There was one particular pilot that liked to drop chocolate. He would kind of get his own little chocolate packages and drop them to the kids. The Soviets did not attack or try to shoot down any airplanes. They didn't want it to become a real war. And so they left them alone. The Allies dropped almost 9,000 tons of necessities, especially fuel and food, every single day for an entire year. The Soviets and the East Germans give up by 1949, and West Berlin remains the capital of West Germany. And that's where we'll stop today. We'll talk a little bit more about some home front things going on next time.